It was the 7th of November, 1775. The Royal Governor of Virginia, the 4th Earl of Dunmore, John Murray, was aboard the William in Norfolk Harbour. It had been almost 7 months since British forces had led an unsuccessful assault on patriots in Lexington and Concord. Since then, the Second Continental Congress had convened and placed a 43-year-old Virginian veteran of the French and Indian War, called George Washington, in control of a new Continental Army, and a battle, which would come to be known as the Battle of Bunker Hill, had taken place on Breed's Hill, near Boston, resulting in a British victory against the rebellious patriots. But the British had suffered 2 times as many casualties as their opponents, leading the British General Henry Clinton to comment on the battle, "A dear-bought victory. Another such would have ruined us." The British were no longer so willing to throw caution to the wind. It was clear now that the rebels represented a serious threat to British rule in the colonies, and from then on they would heed the words of the second Duke of Northumberland, who had said of the rebels that "whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about." The British still had significant reason to be confident. The British Empire represented one of the mightiest war machines in the Western world, and about 20% of the colonists were still staunch supporters of the Crown, mostly concentrated in seaport cities like New York and Philadelphia. On the 26th of October, 1775, the fighting came to the south of Massachusetts for the first time, with conflict breaking out in Hampton, Virginia. Aboard the William, Lord Dunmore, as Royal Governor of Virginia, drafted a proclamation. "I do hereby further declare all indentured servants, negroes, or others, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing the colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity." 7 days later, on the 14th of November, 1775, after a skirmish at Kemp's Landing on the Elizabeth River, which had seen Dunmore rout a colonial militia and capture its 2 commanding colonels, Dunmore published the proclamation. He had just freed every slave who was willing to escape their masters and fight for the British crown, and the colonists were not happy about it. In fact, they were horrified. The Continental Congress instructed the committee whose job it was to arm Patriot vessels to engage the Virginian governor's fleet, taking or destroying his ships, and told the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army to do whatever was necessary to effectually repel Lord Dunmore's violences and secure the peace and safety of that colony. When Thomas Jefferson produced the first draft of the Declaration of Independence over half a year later, it would originally include this section directed at the king. "He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another." This strange section, both blaming the king for forcing the patriots to commit slavery and condemning him for offering them freedom for resisting those who enslaved them, was characteristic of Jefferson's unique stance on slavery, and it would be edited out by the Continental Congress, who thought its tone was too abolitionist. However, its original inclusion made it clear that the attempt to raise insurrection amongst the slaves was a motivation for independence, especially in Virginia. For many colonists, including those who up until that point supported the British or had been somewhat ambivalent, the war for independence became a war for the maintenance of slavery in the colonies. For Dunmore, however, the benefits of recruiting slaves were obvious, and altruism didn't enter into it. Firstly, having slaves escape from plantations owned by the rebels would deprive the Patriots of their workers, forcing them to return home to protect their families and property. Secondly, the Crown's forces were in need of the military labourers the slaves could provide. Dunmore had already had an unofficial policy of recruiting slaves to augment his force of 300 white soldiers and seamen as early as June, and in early August it was reported that the governor's cutter had carried off a number of slaves belonging to private gentlemen. It was only his military success at Kemp's Landing which had emboldened him to make his policy of slave recruitment official. On the 9th of December, Dunmore, with a force of 600, took the initiative and attacked Great Bridge, a fortified section of the Elizabeth River, 10 miles below Norfolk. Dunmore's assault was decisively rebuffed, and his force took 61 casualties. After 25 minutes of fighting, his troops retreated back to Norfolk. He decided that he could not hold the city, and ordered his followers onto ships in the harbour. Still, slaves continued to escape and join Dunmore, reaching him by water, and Dunmore armed them as fast as they came in. He dressed them in military garb, with the words "Liberty to Slaves" inscribed across the breasts of their uniforms. He officially designated them Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. The only major military action they were involved in was the aforementioned Battle of Great Bridge. However, they were involved in other skirmishes too. The slaves were put on small crafts which sailed in and out of river settlements, harassing plantations, and they were also used as pilots, as was the case with Joseph Harris, a runaway who served as the pilot of the Otter. As a naval officer had said of him, "I think him too useful to His Majesty's service to take away, his being well acquainted with many creeks in the eastern shore, at York, James River, and Nansemond, and many others, and accustomed to pilot." The former slaves were also put to work foraging to increase the governor's supply of fresh food, which was being continuously expended. Some of them would form marauding parties which struck plantations at night, looting livestock to bring back to the British. Unfortunately, most of the former slaves who fled to Dunmore were not destined for freedom, but for death to smallpox. As Dunmore wrote to his superior in England, the formation of his Ethiopian regiment would have been in great forwardness had not a fever crept in amongst them, which carried off a great many very fine fellows. By June 1776, disease had defeated Dunmore. His ranks had been decimated despite his attempts to isolate the sick from the well in the cramped conditions aboard the ships. Only 150 former slaves were still alive by this point, although they were being reinforced as new runaway slaves joined Dunmore each day. Added to this the continual harassment of Dunmore's forces by the Patriot militia, Dunmore's retreat in July was inevitable. Historians think that Dunmore recruited around 1,500 former slaves, including men, women, and children. Disease appears to have killed around 2/3 of them, leaving only 300 black men, with a number of other women and children by the time of Dunmore's departure, the healthiest of whom were destined for further military service. However, this was only a tiny fraction of the slaves who escaped to join the British, or were otherwise freed by them over the course of the war. The royal governors of South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia also brought retinues of escaped slaves with them to New York after being deposed, although very few. At least some of these were evacuated to Nova Scotia at the end of the war. In January 1777, British warships entering the James River were met with more slave defections, as General William Howe had issued a proclamation that all slaves belonging to the Patriot rebels would receive protection if they made it to the British lines, causing many to flee with their families. When Howe arrived in the upper Chesapeake on August the 25th, 1777, the escaped slaves were assimilated into an assault on Philadelphia. In total, no more than a few hundred slaves joined Howe. Further raids on plantations by British ships along the Chesapeake until the summer of 1779 saw many more slaves taken by British forces. When the British took Savannah, many white Georgians fled and left their slaves behind. Some of them joined with the British, likely around 1500. The rest became sequestered slaves and were assigned to work on abandoned plantations or impressed to work for the military, but they were not given their freedom by the British. Equally, those colonists who supported the Crown were allowed to keep their slaves. In South Carolina, Henry Clinton also came with a proclamation of freedom to slaves who deserted their Patriot owners. After the fall of Charleston, so many slaves rushed to join the British that Cornwallis asked for advice from Clinton on how to stem the tide. Clinton told him to return Loyalist slaves, but Cornwallis refused to do so. It has been quoted that this represented some 10,000 slaves, but that number is inclusive of sequestered slaves who had been abandoned by or captured with their Patriot masters, and were therefore not deemed eligible for freedom. The number was likely in the lower thousands. Many more slaves escaped to British lines during 1780 as Cornwallis marched into North Carolina. His army soon joined with Benedict Arnold's in the spring of 1781, who had brought with him hundreds of defecting slaves on his push up the James River. By the time they reached Yorktown, Cornwallis had about 3,000 former slaves, and by July 1781, another 1,500 in nearby Portsmouth. Many of these, too, died of disease, despite attempts at inoculation. The Royal Navy and its accompanying fleet of privateers also recruited from along the Atlantic seaboard throughout the war. Black runaways were less likely to desert than white seamen, and were pressed into the Navy at such a rate that almost every ship in the entire British fleet in America, which represented about half of the entire British Navy, had at least a handful of African American crew members. Some had as many as 20%, and on privateers the percentage may well have been higher. At least 5,000 black runaways were taken into the British Navy throughout the war. In total then, a conservative number for runaways who joined the British between 1775 to 1782 is about 20,000, with about 12,000 of those coming from the south. Out of that 20,000, about 12,000 reached the end of the war without dying or being recaptured. However, that includes a number who were enslaved to Loyalists. The number of African Americans who left with the British as free people was between 8,000 and 10,000. The majority of those who were evacuated with the British in 1782 to 83 went to East Florida, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Nova Scotia, New York, and England. The British kept to their agreement to free the runaways, taking them with them as free men against the terms of the Paris Peace Treaty, marking one of the most significant acts of emancipation in early American history. If you enjoyed this video, leave a comment, and remember to like and subscribe for future content. If you want to support the channel further, check out my Patreon, the link to which is in the description, and I'll see you next time.